The hospital bustled with activity as nurses and doctors moved through the halls. Machines beeped, and the faint murmur of conversations created a symphony of life-saving urgency. Grace Carter, a seasoned black nurse in her mid-30s, stood at the central nursing station. She scanned the assignment chart and found her name next to a new patient, Mary Whitaker. Grace took a deep breath. "Another day, another patient," she murmured to herself, adjusting her scrubs. The orderly wheeled in Mrs. Whitaker, a frail white woman with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the room critically, her lips tightening into a thin line. When Grace entered the room, clipboard in hand, Mary's eyes immediately narrowed. Grace smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. My name is Grace Carter, and I'll be your nurse." Mary's lips curled slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Well," she said, her voice cold and clipped, "this is unexpected." Grace ignored the comment, her professionalism unwavering. "I see you've been admitted after a minor stroke. We'll be focusing on your recovery and ensuring you're comfortable." Mary huffed, her eyes darting away. "Comfortable? I doubt that's possible in a place like this." Grace maintained her calm demeanor, gently adjusting Mary's pillow. "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help, Mrs. Whitaker." Mary didn't respond, but her expression spoke volumes. Later that evening, the soft hum of the television filled Mary's room. The door creaked open, and a young woman stepped in carrying a bouquet of bright flowers. "Grandma!" Emma Whitaker exclaimed, rushing to Mary's side. Emma, in her early 20s, had an easy smile and an air of openness that contrasted starkly with her grandmother's reserved nature. "Emma," Mary said, her tone softening slightly, "I wasn't expecting you." Emma placed the flowers on the bedside table and turned to Grace, who had been adjusting the four-drip. "Thank you so much for taking care of her," she said, smiling warmly at Grace. Grace nodded. "It's my pleasure. Your grandmother is in good hands." Mary's sharp voice cut through the warmth. "I should hope so, though I can't say I'm reassured." Emma frowned. "Grandma, that's not necessary." Mary waved a hand dismissively. "I'm just speaking the truth." Emma looked apologetically at Grace, who only smiled. "I'll leave you two to talk," Grace said and exited the room gracefully. Emma turned to Mary, her voice firm. "You don't have to be rude, Grandma. Grace is doing her best." Mary sniffed. "I'm entitled to my opinions." Emma sighed deeply, realizing that her grandmother's prejudices were as unyielding as ever. As night fell, the room dimmed. Mary shifted uncomfortably in her bed, struggling to reach the remote to adjust her bed's position. After several futile attempts, she pressed the call button. Moments later, Grace appeared, her calm presence a stark contrast to Mary's irritation. "What do you need, Mrs. Whitaker?" "My bed," Mary snapped. "It's too low. Fix it." Grace moved swiftly, adjusting the bed with practiced ease. "Is that better?" Mary grumbled. "I suppose it will do." Grace stepped back, her hands folded. "Anything else?" Mary stared at her for a moment before muttering, "Why do you even bother?" Grace met her gaze steadily. "Because it's my job, Mrs. Whitaker. I'm here to help." Mary didn't reply, instead turning her head to stare out the window. The break room was a haven for the hospital staff, offering a brief respite from the demands of their work. Grace sat at a small table with Nurse Lisa, sipping her coffee. "How's the new patient?" Lisa asked. Grace let out a small sigh. "She's challenging. She's made it clear she's not happy with me." Lisa nodded knowingly. "Patients like her, they're stuck in their ways. Don't take it personally." Grace smiled faintly. "I don't, but I wonder if I can change her mind." Lisa chuckled. "You're braver than me. Just do your job and let her deal with her own issues." Grace didn't respond, but determination gleamed in her eyes. The next day, Mary's heart monitor began beeping rapidly. Grace, who was nearby, rushed into the room. Mary's face was pale, and her breathing was shallow. "Mrs. Whitaker, stay calm," Grace said as she adjusted Mary's floor and called for the doctor. Her hands moved with precision, her voice steady and reassuring. Within minutes, the crisis was averted. The doctor praised Grace's quick thinking, and Mary, though still weak, looked at Grace with a mixture of grudging acknowledgement and confusion. "You did your job," Mary said faintly. "That's all." Grace smiled. "I'm glad you're feeling better, Mrs. Whitaker." Emma arrived in the evening, her face lined with worry. She spoke quietly with Grace outside the room. "Is she okay?" Emma asked. "She's stable now," Grace reassured her. "She had a scare earlier, but we handled it." Emma hesitated. "I'm sorry about her attitude. She wasn't always like this, you know." Grace nodded. "People change, but it's never too late for them to change again." Emma smiled sadly. "I hope you're right." The next morning, Mary glared at Grace as she brought in her breakfast tray. "Took you long enough," Mary snapped. Grace set the tray down gently. "I was attending to a patient in critical condition. I apologize for the delay." Mary sniffed. "I shouldn't have to wait." Grace met her gaze evenly. "Every patient here is important, Mrs. Whitaker, including you." Mary didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted. That night, Mary lay awake, her mind replaying the events of the day. She thought about Grace's calmness, her skill, and her unflinching professionalism. For the first time, Mary felt a pang of guilt. She turned to stare at the moonlight filtering through the window, her thoughts muddled with emotions she couldn't quite name. The sun rose over the hospital, casting warm light through the blinds of Mary's room. Grace entered with her usual composure, carrying a clipboard and a tray of morning medications. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," she said with her usual warmth. "I'm here to check your vitals and make sure you're set for the day." Mary glanced at her, lips pursed. "I'll wait for someone else." Grace paused, her smile unwavering. "I'm the nurse assigned to you, Mrs. Whitaker. If there's something I can do to make you more comfortable, please let me know." Mary's eyes narrowed. "Just get on with it." Grace approached the bedside and began her routine, explaining each step. "I'm taking your blood pressure now. This may feel a little tight." Mary grumbled under her breath, but complied. Grace finished and updated the chart. Before leaving, she adjusted Mary's blankets with care. As Grace left, Mary watched her with an expression that teetered between disdain and begrudging respect. Later in the morning, Dr. Patel entered Mary's room with Grace at his side. He carried a clipboard filled with detailed charts and scans. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Dr. Patel greeted. "Let's review your progress." Mary sat upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm sure there's not much progress to report, considering." Dr. Patel frowned slightly but continued. "Your vitals are stable, and the physical therapy exercises Nurse Carter has suggested are an important next step." Mary looked skeptical. "Physical therapy? At my age?" Grace interjected gently. "It'll help with your mobility, Mrs. Whitaker. We'll take it at your pace." Dr. Patel smiled approvingly. "Exactly. Nurse Carter will guide you through it." Mary shot Grace a look but said nothing, silently bracing herself for the inevitable. By lunchtime, Mary's frustration simmered. Grace brought in a tray of food, broiled chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables. "Here's your lunch, Mrs. Whitaker," Grace said, placing the tray on the table. Mary looked at the plate with disgust. This is what they serve? It's unfit for someone of my status." Grace raised an eyebrow but kept her tone light. "I'll let the chef know he's cooking for royalty tomorrow." Mary blinked at her, caught off guard by the humor. For a moment, her lips twitched as if to smile, but she quickly covered it with a scowl. "You think you're funny, do you?" Mary said, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. "Not at all," Grace replied smoothly. "I just want you to eat something. You'll need your strength." Mary hesitated, then picked up her fork, though her face remained a mask of displeasure. That afternoon, Mary was wheeled into the common area to encourage mobility and interaction. She sat in her wheelchair, observing the other patients with thinly veiled disdain. Nearby, Grace knelt beside an elderly man named George, a gregarious patient who often cracked jokes. He laughed heartily as Grace helped adjust his walker. "You're a gem, Nurse Carter," George said, patting her hand. "Don't know what we'd do without you." Grace smiled warmly. "Thank you, George. Let me know if you need anything else." Mary watched the interaction from a distance, her expression unreadable. As Grace walked by her wheelchair, she turned away, pretending to look out the window. Later that evening, Emma arrived with a book and a thermos of tea for her grandmother. She sat at the bedside, flipping through the pages. "Grandma," Emma began cautiously, "do you think you might be a little too hard on Nurse Carter?" Mary's head snapped toward her. "What's that supposed to mean?" Emma hesitated but pressed on. "She's been nothing but kind to you, and you're not making it easy for her." Mary huffed. "Kindness doesn't change anything. I don't trust people who put on a show." Emma sighed. "It's not a show, Grandma. She's just a good person. Maybe it's time to let go of—" "Enough, Emma," Mary interrupted sharply. "You don't understand." Emma bit her lip, then placed her hand over Mary's. "Maybe I don't, but I think you'd feel better if you tried." Mary didn't reply, staring at the book in Emma's lap as if it were suddenly fascinating. That night, Mary couldn't sleep. She pressed the call button, and Grace appeared promptly. "Can't sleep?" Grace asked, adjusting Mary's pillows. Mary hesitated, then blurted, "Why did you become a nurse?" Grace raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. She pulled up a chair. "Well, my mother was sick for a long time when I was a child. I watched the nurses take care of her, and I knew that's what I wanted to do." Mary's lips tightened. "Your mother, was she?" "She passed away when I was 10, Grace said softly. "But her kindness, her strength, it stayed with me. I wanted to carry that forward." Mary stared at her for a long moment. "I see." Grace smiled faintly. "Anything else I can help you with?" Mary shook her head, her voice quiet. "No, thank you." The next morning, Mary sat in her wheelchair by the window, watching Grace interact with another nurse. Grace's movements were efficient, her demeanor calm and professional. She placed a comforting hand on a patient's shoulder, her smile genuine. For the first time, Mary felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of doubt. Her rigid beliefs, so deeply ingrained, now felt slightly less certain. She frowned, pushing the thought away, but it lingered like an unwelcome guest. That evening, Grace brought Mary's medications as usual. As she handed over the pills, Mary hesitated. "I suppose," Mary began awkwardly, her voice stiff, "I should thank you for what you've done." Grace paused, then smiled. "It's my job, Mrs. Whitaker. I'm happy to help." Mary looked away, her voice faltering. "Even when I haven't made it easy?" Grace's smile didn't waver. "It's part of the job, too." Mary said nothing more, but as Grace left the room, she felt the faintest flicker of warmth in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. The morning was bright, but the mood in Mary's room was somber. Grace entered with a clipboard and a determined expression. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Grace greeted. "Today, we're starting physical therapy." Mary's lips thinned. "I'm not interested in humiliating myself." Grace pulled up a chair. "It's not about humiliation. It's about getting stronger, one step at a time." Mary folded her arms. "I've lived this long without someone telling me how to walk." Grace smiled slightly. "And now, we're working to make sure you keep walking. I'll be with you the whole time." Mary grumbled, but allowed herself to be guided to the therapy area. The small steps she took with Grace's assistance were slow and hesitant, but Grace's steady encouragement kept her moving. As they returned to the room, Mary looked at Grace for a moment longer than usual. "You're persistent, aren't you?" Grace chuckled softly. "When it comes to my patients, yes." That afternoon, Mary sat by the window, staring out at the hospital courtyard. Emma had left a book on the table, but Mary didn't touch it. Grace entered to check on her. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Whitaker?" Mary hesitated before replying. "I was just thinking about something." Grace noticed the faraway look in her eyes. "Would you like to talk about it?" Mary shook her head. "It's nothing." Grace lingered a moment before responding. "Sometimes talking helps." Mary sighed. "When I was a girl, the world was different. People stayed in their place." Grace didn't interrupt, letting the silence draw Mary's thoughts out. "My father used to say it was better that way," Mary continued. "But sometimes I wonder." Grace tilted her head slightly. "Wonder what?" Mary shook her head again, cutting the conversation short. Nothing. Forget I said anything? Grace nodded gently and left, but Mary's words lingered in her mind. Later, Grace was helping George, the elderly man from the common area, adjust his walker near Mary's room. "You're a real gem, Nurse Carter," George said loudly enough for Mary to hear, "always going above and beyond." "It's part of the job, George," Grace replied modestly, guiding him down the hallway. Mary sat silently in her room, the words replaying in her mind. For all her complaints about Grace, she couldn't deny the consistency of her care. That evening, Grace brought Mary's dinner and set the tray down carefully. "I brought you something lighter tonight. Soup and a roll," Grace said. "I know the last meal wasn't your favorite." Mary glanced at the tray, then at Grace. "You remembered." Grace smiled. "I try to pay attention." Mary hesitated. "Thank you." It was a small gesture, but it marked the first time Mary had acknowledged Grace with genuine gratitude. Grace nodded, her smile soft but encouraging. The hospital was quiet that night, the corridors dimly lit. Mary lay awake, her thoughts restless. She pressed the call button, and Grace arrived moments later. "Can't sleep again?" Grace asked, her voice gentle. Mary shook her head. "I've been thinking." Grace raised an eyebrow, pulling a chair closer. "About what?" Mary hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "About my father. He wasn't a kind man, but he was respected. He taught me certain things about people." Grace listened without interrupting. "For years, I thought those things were true," Mary continued. "But I look at you, and I wonder, maybe he was wrong." Grace's heart ached at the vulnerability in Mary's voice. "It's never too late to see the world differently, Mrs. Whitaker." Mary didn't reply, but her expression softened, and she lay back down, her thoughts still heavy but somehow lighter. The next morning, Emma visited with a box of chocolates. She noticed something different about her grandmother. "You seem calmer today," Emma observed. Mary shrugged. "I've been thinking about some things." Emma smiled. "That's a start." Mary looked at her granddaughter thoughtfully. "You were right about Nurse Carter." Emma's face lit up. "I'm glad you see that, Grandma. She really cares." Mary nodded, though her expression remained pensive. "She's different from what I expected." Later that day, Grace arrived to help Mary with another physical therapy session. Mary didn't argue this time, instead allowing herself to be guided to the therapy room. "Let's try a few more steps today," Grace encouraged. Mary nodded, her movements slow but deliberate. At one point, she stumbled slightly, and Grace caught her arm. "You're doing great," Grace said, studying her. Mary looked at her, a flicker of trust in her eyes. "Thank you, Grace." It was the first time Mary had used her nurse's name, and Grace's smile widened slightly. "You're welcome, Mrs. Whitaker." That evening, Mary sat alone in her room. The flowers Emma had brought were in full bloom, and the book on the table was open to a marked page. For the first time in years, Mary allowed herself to question the beliefs she had clung to for so long. She thought of Grace, her skill, her patience, and her quiet strength. A small part of her felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The therapy room was bustling with patients, some walking slowly with assistance, others sitting in wheelchairs watching the activity around them. Mary sat at the edge of a padded bench, her face tight with concentration as Grace stood nearby, encouraging her. "Take it one step at a time, Mrs. Whitaker," Grace said, her voice calm but firm. "There's no rush." Mary gripped the parallel bars tightly, her knuckles white. "I don't know why you bother. I'll never get better." Grace crouched slightly to meet Mary's gaze. "That's not true. You've made progress already. One step forward, no matter how small, is still a step." Mary looked away, her face a mix of frustration and something else, doubt. "It feels pointless." Grace smiled gently. "Healing takes time, and you're stronger than you think." Mary hesitated, then shuffled forward with Grace's help. Each small step felt monumental, and by the end of the session, she sank into her wheelchair with a soft sigh. "You did well today," Grace said, her tone warm and reassuring. Mary glanced at her briefly, muttering, Thank you. The words were quiet, but carried a sincerity that surprised even her. Back in her room, Mary was surprised to see an old friend from her social club, Margaret, entering with a bright smile and a basket of fruit. "Mary, darling, how are you?" Margaret exclaimed, setting the basket on the bedside table. Mary's smile was faint. "Margaret, I didn't expect to see you here." They chatted for a while, catching up on old acquaintances and neighborhood gossip. Margaret's eyes drifted to the door as Grace entered to check Mary's vitals. "And who is this?" Margaret asked with polite curiosity. "This is Nurse Carter," Mary said, her tone neutral. Grace nodded politely. "Nice to meet you." Margaret leaned toward Mary after Grace left. "Well, she seems capable. But I didn't think this hospital hired, well, you know." Mary's stomach twisted at Margaret's words. "She's very good at her job," Mary replied curtly. Margaret blinked in surprise, but quickly changed the subject. Mary, however, couldn't shake the discomfort that lingered after Margaret's visit. That evening, Mary struggled to keep her dinner tray steady. Her hands trembled slightly, a side effect of her stroke. Before she could call for help, Grace appeared. "Let me assist you," Grace said, gently taking the tray. "I can manage," Mary said, though her tone lacked conviction. Grace ignored the protest and began cutting the food into smaller pieces. "There's no harm in accepting help, Mrs. Whitaker. That's why I'm here." Mary watched silently as Grace worked. "Do you always do this? Care for people like me?" Grace glanced at her, a soft smile on her face. "People like you are why I became a nurse." Mary's lips parted slightly as if to say something, but she closed them again, her thoughts swirling. Emma arrived the next morning, carrying a thermos of tea and a photograph album. She sat by Mary's bedside, flipping through the pages. "Look, Grandma," Emma said, pointing to a picture. "This was from our trip to the beach when I was little. Do you remember?" Mary squinted at the photo, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I remember. Your grandfather insisted on wearing that ridiculous straw hat." Emma laughed, then grew serious. "You seem different lately. Has something changed?" Mary hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the door. "I've been thinking about Grace." Emma leaned forward, curiosity bright in her eyes. "What about her?" Mary looked down at her hands. "She's not what I expected. She's kind, patient, more than I deserve." Emma reached out, squeezing Mary's hand. "I'm proud of you, Grandma." Mary didn't respond, but her eyes glistened slightly as she turned the page. That afternoon, Grace was adjusting Mary's pillows when a loud crash echoed from the hallway. A young nurse had dropped a tray of equipment, and a startled cry followed. "Well, that was dramatic," Mary said dryly, her lips twitching. Grace chuckled softly. "It happens to all of us at some point." Mary raised an eyebrow. "Even you?" Grace grinned. "Especially me. My first week on the job, I dropped an entire cart of syringes in front of a room full of doctors." Mary let out a small laugh, the sound surprising them both. "I suppose even the best make mistakes." Grace nodded, her smile widening. "Exactly." The moment was brief, but it carried a warmth that lingered long after Grace left the room. Margaret returned a few days later, her bright demeanor unchanged. She sat in the chair by Mary's bed, chattering away about a charity event. At one point, Grace entered to administer medication. Margaret watched her closely, then turned to Mary with a knowing smile. "You seem to have a very attentive nurse," Margaret said after Grace left. "She's excellent," Mary replied, her tone firm. Margaret hesitated, then leaned closer. "But don't you feel uncomfortable having someone like her?" Mary cut her off sharply. "Margaret, that's enough. Grace is a professional, and I won't hear another word against her." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. "Well, I didn't mean to offend." "You did," Mary said coolly, "and I won't tolerate it." Margaret quickly excused herself, leaving Mary to stare out the window, her emotions conflicted but resolute. That evening, Mary asked to speak with Grace privately. Grace, curious but cautious, pulled up a chair by the bed. "I wanted to say," Mary began, her voice faltering, "I've been wrong about many things. About you. Grace's expression softened, but she didn't interrupt. I grew up in a world that taught me to see people like you as less, Mary continued, her voice thick with emotion. But you've shown me how wrong I was. Grace smiled gently. Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. It means a lot to hear that. Mary looked away, wiping at her eyes. I still have a long way to go, but I wanted you to know. Grace reached out, placing a comforting hand on Mary's arm. Acknowledging it is the first step, and I'm here to help. The next morning, Mary greeted Grace with a small smile when she entered the room. Good morning, Grace, Mary said, the words carrying a newfound warmth. Grace's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but she quickly returned the smile. Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. As Grace began her routine, Mary watched her with an unfamiliar sense of gratitude. For the first time, the walls she had built around herself felt less like a fortress and more like something she could dismantle. The sunlight streamed softly through the hospital room as Grace entered with her usual clipboard. Mary was already awake, sitting up in bed with a thoughtful expression. Good morning, Grace, Mary greeted, her tone gentler than it had ever been. Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. How are you feeling today? Grace asked, setting the clipboard on the side table. Mary hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. I've been thinking about the things I said to you when I first arrived. Grace paused, looking at her with quiet encouragement. You don't have to. No, I do, Mary interrupted. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. I was cruel and unfair. I judged you without knowing you, and for that, I'm sorry. Grace sat down in the chair beside the bed, her expression kind. Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Whitaker. It means a lot to me. Mary's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. You've shown me more patience and kindness than I deserve. I don't know how to repay that. Grace smiled softly. You just did. Later that morning, Grace helped Mary with her physical therapy session. Mary's movements were slow but deliberate, each step more confident than the last. Other patients and nurses watched, offering quiet encouragement. You're doing great, Mrs. Whitaker, Grace said as she supported Mary's arm. Mary paused at the end of the parallel bars, breathing heavily but smiling faintly. It feels good to move again. Grace handed her a small towel. That's the strength you've had all along. You just needed to find it. As they returned to the room, Mary whispered, Thank you, Grace. You're welcome, Grace replied, her tone warm. Emma visited in the afternoon, carrying a canvas tote bag filled with books and treats. As she walked into the room, she noticed the subtle shift in her grandmother's demeanor. Grandma, you look brighter today, Emma said, settling into the chair beside the bed. Mary smiled faintly. I feel brighter. Emma glanced at Grace, who was checking Mary's blood pressure. Is this your doing? She asked Grace playfully. Grace chuckled. It's a team effort. Mary's voice softened. It's her doing. She's been a better person to me than I've been to her. Emma's eyes widened in surprise, and she reached out to squeeze her grandmother's hand. I'm so proud of you, Grandma. Mary's lips trembled, and for the first time, she allowed Emma's words to truly sink in. That evening, Mary lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The memory of her father's voice echoed in her mind, a gruff, commanding tone that had shaped much of her worldview. People like them don't belong with us, he had said, his words laced with disdain. Mary closed her eyes tightly, trying to push the memory away. But instead, she thought of Grace, her quiet strength, her unwavering patience. The contrast was stark, and for the first time, Mary felt anger not at the world, but at the beliefs she had inherited. Was it all a lie? She whispered into the darkness. The next morning, Mary surprised Grace by handing her a small, neatly folded envelope. What's this? Grace asked, tilting her head curiously. A thank you note, Mary said quietly. I didn't know how else to express what I feel. Grace opened the envelope carefully and read the handwritten note. The words were shaky but heartfelt. Dear Grace, you've been more than a nurse to me. You've been a teacher, a guide, and a light in a very dark place. Thank you for showing me kindness when I showed none. You've changed me in ways I never thought possible. With gratitude, Mary Whitaker. Grace looked up, her eyes glistening. Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. This means the world to me. Mary nodded, her face soft with vulnerability. You've earned it. That afternoon, Margaret returned, her usual cheerful demeanor intact. She sat down, chatting about a charity event, but Mary's responses were short. Margaret's tone shifted as she asked, "So, how are things with that nurse? She's still taking care of you?" Mary's face hardened. "Her name is Grace." Margaret blinked, startled. "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it." "You did," Mary said firmly, "and I won't tolerate it anymore. Grace is an exceptional nurse and a good person. If you can't see that, Margaret, then perhaps it's you who needs to rethink things." Margaret's face flushed, and she quickly excused herself. As the door closed behind her, Mary felt a surge of pride, an unfamiliar but empowering sensation. That evening, Grace sat by Mary's bed as they talked. For the first time, their conversation drifted beyond medical updates. "Do you have a family, Grace?" Mary asked hesitantly. "I do," Grace replied, her face lighting up. "I have a son. He's 8 years old and keeps me on my toes." Mary smiled faintly. "What's his name?" "Daniel," Grace said, her voice filled with warmth. "He's the reason I pushed so hard. I want him to grow up in a world where kindness matters more than anything else." Mary's expression grew thoughtful. "I've spent so long clinging to beliefs that don't matter. Maybe it's time I let them go." Grace reached out, placing a comforting hand on Mary's. "It's never too late to change, Mrs. Whitaker." The following morning, Mary insisted on walking to the common area without the wheelchair. With Grace by her side, she shuffled slowly but steadily, her determination evident. As they reached the common area, the other patients and nurses applauded softly, their encouragement filling the room. Mary looked around, her face flushed with effort and pride. She turned to Grace, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." Grace smiled back, her voice filled with emotion. "You did this, Mrs. Whitaker. I just helped you find the way." The morning began with an air of determination in Mary's room. She sat at the edge of her bed, her posture straighter than usual, her expression calm but resolute. When Grace entered, Mary greeted her with a small but confident smile. "Good morning, Grace," Mary said, her tone light but steady. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. You look ready for the day," Grace replied, smiling. Mary nodded. "I am. I think I'm finally starting to feel like myself again." "No, better than myself?" Grace checked Mary's vitals, nodding approvingly. "Your progress has been remarkable. Keep this up, and you'll be out of here before you know it." Mary chuckled softly. "I think I'll miss having you around." Grace's smile widened. "The feeling is mutual." Later that morning, Grace joined Mary in the common area during her break. They sat near a sunny window, the warm light casting a golden glow around them. "I never thought I'd enjoy spending time in a place like this," Mary admitted, sipping tea from a small cup. Grace raised an eyebrow, her tone playful. "It's not exactly a five-star resort, but it has its moments." Mary chuckled. "It's not the place, Grace. It's the people. You've shown me that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Mary spoke again. "You mentioned your son, Daniel. Does he know how lucky he is to have you as a mother?" Grace laughed softly. "I think he might. He's my greatest joy, though he's also a handful." Mary's smile softened. "He's lucky to have you. I hope he grows up knowing that." That afternoon, Mary called Emma on the phone. Grace lingered in the room, tidying up as Mary spoke. "Emma," Mary said firmly, "I want you to bring Daniel a gift from me. Something small but meaningful. Grace has given me so much, and I'd like to show my appreciation." Emma's surprised voice crackled through the receiver. "Of course, Grandma. What should I bring?" "Books," Mary said after a moment's thought. "Children's books. Something he can cherish." When Mary hung up, she glanced at Grace, whose expression was a mix of surprise and gratitude. "I hope you don't mind." Grace smiled warmly. "Not at all. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Whitaker." Mary's lips quirked into a small smile. "It's the least I can do." The therapy room was filled with its usual buzz, but today felt different. Mary stood at the parallel bars, her grip firm but relaxed. Grace stood beside her, encouraging her softly. "This time, I want you to take 3 steps without my support," Grace said, her voice steady but confident. Mary nodded, determination etched into her features. Slowly, she lifted her foot, placing it forward. Then another step, and another. The room erupted in applause from the staff and other patients. Mary let out a small laugh, her face flushed with pride. "You did it," Grace said, clapping softly. Mary turned to Grace, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." That evening, Mary sat in her room, a photo album open on her lap. The black and white images of her youth stared back at her, evoking a mix of emotions. When Grace entered to check on her, Mary gestured for her to sit down. "I want to show you something," Mary said, pointing to a photo of a stern-looking man in a suit. "That's my father." Grace sat quietly, her gaze shifting between Mary and the photo. "He was rigid," Mary said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He believed the world was divided into people who belonged and people who didn't. And I grew up thinking he was always right." Grace listened without interrupting, her expression open and understanding. "But I see now," Mary continued, her voice breaking slightly, "that he was wrong, and I've spent too much of my life living in his shadow." Grace reached out, placing a comforting hand on Mary's. "Acknowledging that takes courage, Mrs. Whitaker. You're stronger than you realize." Mary looked at Grace, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I wouldn't have realized it without you." The next day, Emma arrived with a neatly wrapped gift. It was a small collection of children's books, each one carefully chosen. "This is for Daniel," Mary said, handing it to Grace. "Please tell him it's from me." Grace took the gift, her expression touched. "I will. Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. He'll love it." Mary's face softened. "It's the least I can do. You've given me so much patience, understanding, a chance to be better." Grace nodded, her voice filled with emotion. "It's been my honor." Later that afternoon, Mary joined Grace in the common area for a special event. The hospital staff had organized a small tea party for the patients, complete with delicate pastries and cheerful decorations. Mary laughed lightly as she sipped her tea. "I feel like a schoolgirl at a tea party." Grace grinned. "It's nice to celebrate progress, isn't it?" Mary nodded, her smile genuine. "It is. And I have you to thank for helping me find joy again." That evening, Grace visited Mary's room to deliver good news. "The doctor says you'll likely be discharged by the end of the week." Mary's expression was a mixture of relief and sadness. "That's wonderful. But I'll miss this place. I'll miss you." Grace sat beside her. "You've come so far, Mrs. Whitaker. This isn't goodbye. It's just the start of a new chapter." Mary smiled faintly. "You've given me so much more than care, Grace. You've given me a new way to see the world." Grace took Mary's hand gently. "And you've shown me what it means to truly make a difference." They sat in comfortable silence, the bond between them now one of mutual respect and understanding. The morning light poured into Mary's hospital room as she sat upright, her belongings neatly packed in a small suitcase beside her bed. Grace entered with her usual clipboard, but her steps were slower, her demeanor more reflective. "Well, Mrs. Whitaker," Grace began with a smile, "today's the big day." Mary nodded, her expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. "It feels strange to leave. This place has become familiar." Grace chuckled softly. "Hospitals have a way of doing that. But it's time for you to step into your next chapter." Mary looked at Grace thoughtfully. "I wouldn't have reached this point without you." Grace placed the clipboard aside and sat on the edge of the bed. "You're the one who did the hard work, Mrs. Whitaker. I just helped you see what you were capable of." Mary's lips quirked into a small smile. "You make it sound so simple." Grace shook her head, her tone gentle. "Growth is never simple, but it's always worth it." Emma arrived shortly after, her arms filled with a bouquet of flowers and a bright smile on her face. "Grandma, look at you," Emma said, placing the flowers on the bedside table. You look ready to take on the world." Mary chuckled softly. "I don't know about the world, but I'm ready to take the first step." Emma glanced at Grace, her expression grateful. "You've worked miracles, Nurse Carter." Grace smiled modestly. "Your grandmother is the miracle. She's come so far." Emma sat beside Mary, taking her hand. "I'm proud of you, Grandma. You've grown so much." Mary squeezed Emma's hand gently, her voice soft. "It's never too late to change, Emma. Remember that." As Mary prepared to leave, she handed Grace a small, neatly wrapped box. Grace looked at it with surprise. "What's this?" Grace asked, her brow furrowing. "A small token of my appreciation," Mary said, her tone firm. "You've given me so much. I wanted to give you something in return." Grace opened the box carefully, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a small charm in the shape of a heart. Inscribed on the charm were the words, "With gratitude." Grace's eyes glistened as she looked at Mary. "This is beautiful. Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. I'll treasure it." Mary smiled warmly. "You've earned it." As Mary was wheeled down the hallway in a transport chair, other nurses and patients stopped to wish her well. George, the elderly patient from the common area, waved enthusiastically. "Look at you, Mary," George exclaimed. "Off to conquer the world, eh?" Mary laughed lightly, her face flushed with joy. "Something like that, George." Grace walked beside her, her hand lightly resting on the chair's handle. As they reached the exit, Mary looked up at her. "Grace," Mary said softly, "I'll never forget what you've done for me." Grace leaned down, her voice gentle. "And I'll never forget you, Mrs. Whitaker. You've shown me the power of change." Mary's eyes glistened as she extended her hand. Grace took it, their grip firm but tender. Emma helped Mary into the car, arranging her belongings neatly in the back seat. As they pulled away from the hospital, Mary stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. "Grandma," Emma said after a moment, "you seem different." Mary turned to her granddaughter, her expression thoughtful. "I am different, Grace. She helped me see a side of myself I didn't know was there." Emma smiled. "I'm glad you let her in." Mary nodded, her voice soft. "So am I." That evening, Grace returned home to find her son, Daniel, playing with his toys in the living room. He looked up excitedly as she entered. "Mom!" he exclaimed, running to hug her. Grace crouched down, embracing him tightly. "Hey, sweetheart, I have something for you." She handed him the gift Mary had sent, a collection of beautifully illustrated children's books. Daniel's eyes lit up as he flipped through the pages. "Who gave me this?" Daniel asked. "A very special lady," Grace said, smiling. "She wanted you to have something to remember her by." Daniel grinned. "I like her already." A few weeks later, Mary attended a community gathering with Emma. The event was filled with neighbors, music, and laughter. Mary felt the sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. As she mingled, she overheard a conversation tinged with prejudice. For the first time, she didn't hesitate. "Excuse me," Mary said firmly, addressing the group. "I used to think the same way, but I've learned that kindness and understanding matter far more than skin color or background." The group fell silent, their faces reflecting surprise and thoughtfulness. Mary walked away, her heart lighter. Back in her home, Mary sat at her writing desk, pen in hand. She wrote slowly but deliberately, her words filled with gratitude and reflection. "Dear Grace, it's been a few weeks since I left the hospital, but your impact on my life remains as strong as ever. You taught me the power of patience, kindness, and change. You gave me the courage to face my own faults and the strength to overcome them. Thank you for everything. You will always have a place in my heart. With gratitude, Mary Whitaker." Mary sealed the envelope and smiled. She felt the peace she hadn't known in years, a peace that came from the realization that change was possible, even late in life. It had been a month since Mary returned home. Her once quiet house now felt alive with new energy. Emma visited regularly, and Mary had taken to daily walks around her garden, relishing her improved mobility. On one sunny morning, Mary stood by her kitchen window, gazing at the vibrant blooms Emma had planted for her. She moved to the table and carefully opened a notebook where she had started journaling, a habit she picked up at Grace's suggestion. Today's entry read, "Growth is not a straight path, but it's worth every step. I've learned that healing isn't just physical, it's emotional too. Grace taught me that. I'll carry her lessons forward." One afternoon, Mary received an unexpected visitor, George, the elderly patient she had bonded with in the hospital. He arrived with a basket of muffins and his trademark cheerful grin. "Mary, you look as spry as ever," George said, settling into a chair in her living room. Mary laughed lightly, pouring them both cups of tea. "And you still have that charm, George." As they chatted, George shared updates about the hospital and the other patients. He paused, his tone becoming more serious. "You know, Mary, we all saw the change in you while you were there. You inspired more people than you realize." Mary looked down, her hands clasped around her teacup. "It wasn't just me, George. Grace." She opened my eyes. George smiled knowingly. "Sometimes, it takes one person to light the way." Motivated by her newfound purpose, Mary decided to volunteer at the local community center. She signed up to assist with a literacy program for underprivileged children, many of whom came from diverse backgrounds. On her first day, she sat with a young boy named Jamal, helping him sound out words in a picture book. He looked up at her with a shy smile. "You're really nice," Jamal said softly. Mary's heart swelled. "Thank you, Jamal. You're doing so well. Keep going." As the session ended, Mary felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She realized that this was her way of paying forward the kindness she had received. One evening, Emma handed Mary an envelope that had arrived in the mail. The handwriting was neat and familiar. Mary opened it eagerly, her heart leaping as she read, "Dear Mrs. Whitaker, I hope this letter finds you well. Daniel and I both love the books you sent. He's been reading them every night, and he often asks about the nice lady who gave them to him. I wanted to let you know that your courage and transformation continue to inspire me. You reminded me why I became a nurse. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your journey. With gratitude, Grace Carter." Mary read the letter twice, her eyes misty. She placed it in her journal, vowing to treasure it forever. A few weeks later, Mary visited the graveyard where her father was buried. She stood before his gravestone, the words, "A life of principles," etched below his name. Mary knelt, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. "Father," she began, her voice steady, "you taught me to live by principles, but I see now that some of them were flawed." She paused, her emotions raw but controlled. "I'm not here to blame you. I'm here to let go. I've spent too long holding on to your fears and prejudices. It's time for me to choose my own path." Mary rose, her heart lighter. For the first time, she felt free from the weight of her past. Mary and Emma spent an evening together sorting through old photo albums. As they flipped through the pages, Mary shared stories about her youth, both the joys and the challenges. "You've been so strong, Grandma," Emma said, placing a hand on Mary's arm. "I hope I can be as brave as you someday." Mary smiled, her eyes soft. "You already are, Emma. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that bravery comes from choosing kindness, even when it's hard." Emma hugged her tightly. "I'm so glad you found peace." Mary was invited to speak at a local event for the community center's literacy program. Nervous but determined, she stood before a small crowd, including Emma and George, who cheered her on. She began, her voice trembling slightly. "I spent much of my life seeing the world through narrow eyes. But recently, I learned that growth is possible at any age." Mary shared her story with honesty, speaking about her time in the hospital and how grace had transformed her perspective. By the end, the audience rose to their feet, applauding warmly. As Mary stepped down from the podium, she felt a sense of pride she had never known before. Months later, Mary visited the hospital for a routine checkup. She requested to see Grace, who greeted her in the hallway with a broad smile. "Mrs. Whitaker," Grace exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. "Please, call me Mary," she replied, pulling Grace into a warm embrace. They sat together in the hospital garden, catching up on their lives. Mary shared her work at the community center, while Grace talked about Daniel's love for reading. "You've given me more than you know, Grace," Mary said, her voice filled with emotion. "You didn't just heal my body. You healed my heart." Grace smiled, her eyes glistening. "And you've reminded me why I do this work." "Thank you, Mary." They parted with a deep sense of connection, their bond unbroken despite the months apart. At the community center, Mary had taken on a more active role. She wasn't just volunteering with the literacy program, she was mentoring other volunteers. On a warm morning, she met Sarah, a young woman who had just joined the program. "Mrs. Whitaker?" Sarah asked hesitantly. "I'm nervous about working with the kids. I've never done this before." Mary smiled warmly, gesturing for Sarah to sit beside her. "You're not alone, Sarah. None of us come into this knowing everything. It's about being patient, listening, and showing them you care." Sarah relaxed under Mary's kind guidance. As the session began, Mary demonstrated how to connect with the children, her tone gentle but firm. Sarah watched in admiration, inspired by Mary's approach. Afterward, Sarah said, "You're amazing with them. I hope I can be like you someday." Mary chuckled softly. "You will be, Sarah. Just remember, growth happens one step at a time." One bright afternoon, Mary received an unexpected visitor at her home. When she opened the door, there stood Grace, holding a small potted plant. "Grace," Mary exclaimed, her face lighting up. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing," Grace said, handing her the plant. "A peace lily. I thought it suited you." Mary chuckled, her hands gently cradling the pot. "It's beautiful. Thank you." The two women sat in the garden, sharing updates about their lives. Grace talked about her son, Daniel, who was excelling in school, while Mary shared stories of her time at the community center. "You found your purpose," Grace observed, her tone warm. Mary nodded, her eyes glistening. "You gave me the courage to find it. I'm so grateful for you, Grace." Grace placed a hand over Mary's. "You've given me just as much, Mary. You've reminded me that change is always possible." That evening, Mary sat in her living room, the peace lily on the table beside her. She looked at the photograph of her late husband on the mantel and smiled softly. "I think you'd be proud of me," she murmured aloud. "It took me too long to get here, but I finally found peace." She opened her journal and began to write. "Change doesn't come easy. It requires facing parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. But when you open your heart to kindness and understanding, the world becomes brighter. I hope to leave this world a little kinder than I found it." One weekend, Emma invited Mary to join her at a local cultural festival. Mary hesitated at first, but Emma's enthusiasm won her over. The festival was vibrant, filled with music, art, and food from various cultures. As they walked through the stalls, Emma pointed out a group of children playing a traditional drum circle. "Isn't this amazing, Grandma?" Mary nodded, her eyes following the children's joyous faces. "It is. There's so much beauty in things I used to overlook." Emma grinned. "You've taught me to see that, too." Mary placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Then maybe I've done something right." At the community center, Mary overheard two volunteers gossiping about a young boy from a low-income family. Their words were dismissive, their tone judgmental. Mary approached them, her expression calm but firm. "Excuse me, but I don't think that's the kind of conversation we should be having here." The volunteers looked startled. "We didn't mean anything by it," one of them stammered. "Words matter," Mary said gently but resolutely. "We're here to lift these children up, not judge them. Let's focus on what we can do to help." The volunteers nodded sheepishly, and Mary walked away, her heart steady with purpose. One day, Grace sent Mary a letter from her son, Daniel. Inside was a crayon drawing of a nurse helping a patient, with a caption that read, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker, for being my mom's friend." Mary's eyes filled with tears as she stared at the simple yet profound message. She placed the drawing on her refrigerator, a reminder of how far she had come and the lives she had touched. Mary returned to the hospital to visit George, who had been readmitted for a minor issue. As she walked through the familiar halls, memories of her time there flooded back. When she reached George's room, he greeted her with his usual cheer. "Mary, I was hoping you'd visit." They chatted for a while, reminiscing about their shared experiences. Before leaving, Mary stopped by the nurses' station to thank the staff. "This place gave me a second chance," she said. "I'll never forget that." At the community center, the children had created a mural to celebrate the volunteers. To Mary's surprise, one section featured her name surrounded by hand-drawn flowers and hearts. "You're an inspiration, Mrs. Whitaker," one of the children said, hugging her tightly. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she knelt to hug the child back. "Thank you. You've all inspired me just as much." As she stood, she looked at the mural, her heart swelling with pride. She realized that her journey wasn't just about her growth. It was about the legacy she was leaving behind. The community center was alive with activity. The children from the literacy program were hosting a showcase event, and Mary stood at the entrance, welcoming parents and visitors. Her posture was proud, her smile warm. Emma arrived, carrying a large bouquet of sunflowers. "For you, Grandma," she said, handing them over. "You've done so much for this community. You deserve to be celebrated." Mary accepted the flowers with misty eyes. "It's not just me, Emma. It's everyone who's believed in change." As the event began, the children took turns reading aloud from their favorite books. Mary sat in the front row, applauding each child enthusiastically. When the final reader finished, the program director called Mary to the stage. "Mrs. Whitaker has been an incredible force of change here," the director said. "Her story is an inspiration, and her dedication has transformed lives." Mary stepped forward, gripping the microphone. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "If you had told me a year ago that I'd be standing here, I wouldn't have believed you. But I've learned that it's never too late to change, not for yourself and not for others." The audience erupted into applause, and Mary felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The following week, Grace visited Mary at home. They sat in the garden, sipping tea under the shade of a blooming tree. "I heard about the event," Grace said, smiling. "You're becoming a bit of a local celebrity." Mary chuckled. "I suppose I am, but it's all thanks to you, Grace. You showed me the way." Grace shook her head gently. "You found the strength within yourself. I just helped you uncover it." Mary reached over, placing her hand on Grace's. "I wish everyone could have a Grace in their life." Grace smiled warmly. "Maybe they do. It just takes time to recognize them." One quiet afternoon, Mary called Emma into the living room. On the coffee table was a small box tied with a ribbon. "Grandma, what's this?" Emma asked, picking up the box. "It's for you," Mary said softly. "Open it." Inside was Mary's journal, filled with her reflections, lessons, and stories from her transformation. "I want you to have this," Mary said, "to remind you that no matter how hard life gets, there's always a chance to grow." Emma's eyes shimmered with tears as she hugged Mary tightly. "Thank you, Grandma. I'll treasure it." That evening, Mary sat at her writing desk, penning a letter to Grace's son, Daniel. "Dear Daniel, your mother is a remarkable woman. She changed my life, and I want you to know how proud you should be of her. She's taught me the value of kindness, patience, and strength, and I hope she's taught you the same. Always cherish her, Daniel. She's a gift to this world. With love, Mary Whitaker." She sealed the letter and placed it in an envelope, smiling softly as she imagined Daniel reading it one day. One night, Mary felt a sharp pain in her chest. Emma rushed her to the hospital, her heart pounding with fear. Mary was admitted for observation, and as she lay in the hospital bed, familiar sights and sounds surrounded her. Grace appeared at her side the next morning, her face filled with concern. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, her tone soft but steady, "you're in good hands." Mary smiled faintly. "If you're here, I know I am." Over the next few days, Grace visited frequently, offering comfort and reassurance. Mary's health improved steadily, and she was soon discharged. As she left, she looked at Grace with deep gratitude. "You've been with me through every step of my journey, and I'll always be here if you need me," Grace replied. Back at home, Mary decided to plant the peace lily Grace had given her in her garden. Emma helped her dig the soil, and together they gently placed the plant into the ground. "This tree will grow strong," Mary said, her voice thoughtful. "Just like I have." Emma nodded, her hand resting on Mary's shoulder. "And it'll remind us of everything you've overcome." As they watered the plant, Mary felt a sense of closure. The garden, once a symbol of solitude, had become a symbol of renewal. At the community center, Mary met with Sarah, her mentee, who had grown more confident in her role. "Sarah," Mary said, handing her a small notebook, "this is for you. It's filled with ideas and advice for working with the children." Sarah accepted it gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. I'll do my best to carry on your work." Mary smiled. "You already are." One evening, Mary sat in her garden, watching the sunset. The peace lily stood tall among the other blooms, its white flowers glowing softly in the fading light. She opened her journal and wrote her final entry. "Life is a journey of growth, love, and forgiveness. I've learned that no matter where you start, it's never too late to change. I hope my story inspires others to open their hearts and find their own path to healing." To Grace, Emma, and all those who have touched my life, you are my greatest gifts. Thank you for teaching me to live again. As Mary closed the journal, a deep peace settled over her. She had come full circle, and her legacy of kindness and change would live on in those she had touched.